Yes, good morning, and good morning to all the panelists. And I hope you can hear me.
Definitely can.
Great, wonderful. There's a lot to unpack on the economy, but I think the constant here in terms of the defining feature is the fact that when the past government was leaving power, we were under an IMF program, and indeed, this current administration came to continue that. And as of this year, and also going into next year with the election, we will still be under an IMF program. And it's actually quite important because the government came into power promising economic stability, trying to turn things around and all of that. There have been some gains, and then there have been other areas that they've kind of struggled with going forward. But what stays or is constant in all of this equation really is that despite all of the rhetoric and despite all the things that we have said about, turning the economy around and sustaining, we still pretty much have, the IMF here with us. And there's still some structural issues that we haven't, fully addressed. So I look at the president's statement, and you look at the economic record, both on the macro and the micro. So on the macro, often there are a number of indicators that we use, from exchange rates to inflation to GDP to reserves to current account to public debt, and even at a sectoral level, you can take industry, agri, and all of that. You can take all those indicators and you can do an analysis of where we are or where we were 7 years ago and where we are now. And you can also do an analysis of where we are compared to last year. And if you look at what the president was saying, a lot of the baseline for his comparison was what happened last year, right? So for example, inflation now beginning to calm down and all of that. But if you actually extended that data point a little bit further back, you see that the story is a bit different, right, in that regard. And that's where I think, we need to have a much deeper debate about the real state of the economy, but also how people feel it in terms of their everyday lived experience and their pocket, going forward. So at the micro level, the president talked a bit about education and expanding free SHS, although there are still issues with equity. He didn't talk much for me about, poverty and living standards, which has actually become a big thing in the last, few years with the cost of living crisis. And I didn't hear him also talk enough about, galamsey, what has been happening. Again, you go back the last few years and there was a lot of rhetoric, and we even had task force being set up and you name it. But the issues still sort of persist in terms of the degradation of our environment. And then on the other social side, yes, he talked a bit about, in fact, he spent the first maybe 7 or so pages of the 32-page document on security. But I think what was pregnant for me in what he said and in the question that you asked really was the issue of constitutional and governance reforms. So on page 6, latter part, President says that there is definitely, and I'm quoting him here, much room for improvement in the workings of the executive arm of government, the judiciary, and our parliament. And there is no ambiguity where the buck stops when it comes to responsibility for what happens in government. It will be an unwise president that would pretend to have all the answers and refuse the advice of his officials. But the fact remains that the president holds, executive power, and that all of the cabinet, including the executive management team, the EMT that we've made a lot of noise about, all act in an advisory manner. I thought the president was being a little bit disingenuous here, if I'm being honest, in a sense that he was trying to sort of shield the vice president in a way but also the fact that, yes, things have happened. And so, yes, ultimate responsibility lies with him because of the nature of the executive presidency that we practice. But the point for me is, if your people have advised, you've got advisors, you've got ministers, people who are experts, and they've proposed a particular course of action, and you decide to go against it, then that in a way tells us how imperial, right, the presidency almost has become, to the extent that we must push, and this is where I'm looking forward to the manifesto proposals that are going to come, the extent to which we can curtail some of these powers to ensure that the government and governance works for each and every one of us. Because at the end of the day, even for those of us as citizens or even in the civic space, what that statement from the president basically means is that you can talk, you can do advocacy, you can do whatever you want, but I can decide to go with it or not, depending on the particular interest that is at stake. And we've seen this from the ARCA deal, we've seen this with a Japa, we've seen it with SML, and a whole range of other things where ordinarily, if you look at the evidence, it will tell you that we shouldn't have gotten ourselves in some of these deals and some of these transactions. So I'll just finish up with what a colleague of mine told me, earlier this week. He says that we have become a NATO nation, NATO, no action, talk only. And that fundamentally reflects this idea that you've got an imperial presidency, an imperial sort of executive that sometimes does not listen to the best of advice, because as the president says, the president holds the executive power and everybody under him, cabinet ministers, everybody just acts in an advisory manner. And that cannot be good for the country going forward.